Great. Thank you so much for joining us today at our VQ chat. We have the composer Robert Fokkens here joining us for our discussion today with him on his piece Spinning Weaving, which was one of our commissioned pieces for the From Home project. So thank you, Rob, and welcome.
Thank you.
Going back to the beginning in 2020, and when we were all in that state of mind, and we came to you with this brief, and then you came back with this piece, Spinning Weaving. So I just wanted to ask you, what was the genesis for that idea when we were collaborating together?
Yes. So I think when you came to me, obviously we were sort of not that locked down, but about to become very locked down again. What last year how last year worked for me is I was writing an opera and doing all of my teaching work online. You know, we were all learning how to do that. I'm sure you guys were doing a similar sort of thing. So from March to June, I was sort of stuck at my desk very intensively doing either writing my opera or doing exams and teaching and that sort of thing online. I did a whole set. I did, I think, 42 online recitals at Cardiff University, which I will never do again. But that was sort of the experience of that time. And essentially, when you came to me and sort of suggested this idea of from home and kind of talking about these sort of two elements of being sort of stuck in lockdown, but also and working from home and all that sort of thing, but also with your interest in the sort of diversity of voices in the UK. The opera that I was working on, Becky Zizwe, is a piece about a young South African guy who grows up in South Africa in sort of the 1980s, 1990s. So it's kind of around as apartheid is kind of being dismantled and the new government's coming in 1994. And he's a very bright young guy, and he eventually kind of comes over to the UK to do postgraduate studies. So that sort of idea of diversity and immigration is kind of built into that piece, I suppose. And so when you asked me about that, those two things kind of somehow connected in my head. And the piece that I then wrote, I took, there are three little arias that are all based on a ground bass in the opera, which Becky Zizwe himself, the main character, sings. And I thought I'd rather enjoyed using that ground bass. I don't normally write a ground bass. I use lots of cycles and that sort of thing, but I don't generally use ground bass. And I'd really enjoyed the effect of that and the music of that I'd really liked. And I liked this idea then of, so the piece then kind of grew from that. And I like the idea of taking, essentially starting with the ground bass, which sort of itself gradually expands into its own sort of, into itself. So it starts with just a tiny fragment of it, and then kind of gradually grows and grows and grows. And whilst that's happening, the texture grows from some sort of very basic kind of sort of primordial materials that gradually then become, at a certain point, you actually get what is essentially a full statement of a verse, as it were, of one of the of the aria, and then it kind of collapses again and disappears and dissipates. So that's sort of the process of the piece.
Can I ask you a little bit about the colors and the sounds that you found? So obviously the main sort of the main moment of the piece, like you said, the aria moment is a sort of lush, kind of quite stringy singing sound, but we start from these sort of quite snippets of sort of slightly strange, ethereal almost colors that sort of float around. How did you find those colors in your head? How did you think of those?
So those colors are colors I'm quite fond of and use quite a lot. In fact, there's a connection to that, the opening texture, what the viola does. There's a connection between that and my violin concerto, which I wrote in 2006, to give you some sense of how much time I spent with that particular sound. It's a very similar sound that the ensemble violins play with. But those, I mean, everything I do on strings, I try out. I spend a lot of time with my violin when I'm composing, because I studied violin at university. I don't play it all anymore. But I spend quite a lot of time when I'm writing a piece for strings, really kind of finding the colors that I'm looking for. So when I had this idea for, like I said, this sort of primordial thing, these little kind of bits of material. So at the opening, you've basically got one phrase of the cantus firmus, the ground bass, being played very, very high in the first violin and the second violin, and the viola is playing this little kind of repeated the sort of two-note pattern, and both of those materials, like I said, they kind of gradually, the second phrase of the piece is 2 phrases of the cantus of the ground bass, sorry. And that material starts slowing down, the viola material starts slowing down, the cello introduces one of the other ideas. But those colors are, like I say, colors I'm very fond of, and colors that I've spent a lot of time kind of exploring and finding on my instrument. And as I said, I've been using them for quite a long time.
So when you have the ideas, and then when you write for particular ensemble, or particular, the string quartet, opera, or maybe wind ensemble, whatever. So, how do you process that? So, idea versus, the medium, and then what's your in your idea, like what's your challenge for the writing for the particularly for string quartet?
I think, this is something I deal with quite a lot with students as well. Something I'm dealing with at the moment, actually, with a particular set of pieces for a project I'm coming up with soon. That, the medium that you work with, you always have like you say, you have an idea. You think, oh, this is great, I must do this. And then you've got the reality of the things that are going to make those sounds for you, and the people who have to make those sounds. And I think it's always challenging, because sometimes you have to, I hate saying this, but essentially composing is always a compromise, basically, from the kind of ideal thing that you have in your head and the sort of perfect thing that you imagine, and then getting to the reality of that with the medium that you are working with is a kind of a creative compromise, which in theory and hopefully and in the best pieces, that compromise actually comes to a better solution, if you see what I mean, and one that works and carries the idea more effectively than the initial thing. So the big thing with working with instruments is understanding what they can do and what they do well, knowing where you can push them. That is going to feel idiomatic and I don't like writing simple music necessarily. I think you'll probably agree with that. Although this is, for me, quite an easy piece, I'm sorry to say. But I think it's sort of, when you're working with instruments, the real challenge is sort of knowing the sort of extreme limit of what players will do well and still make work. And that players aren't going to go, I really don't like doing this. And I think it's a fine line, and it's often very specific lines with all different instruments. And I mean, because I play the violin, I sort of know where those extremes lie. So kind of putting you guys way up at the top of the instrument at the very beginning of the piece, I know it's a little bit pearly and a little bit uncomfortable possibly, but I know it works, and I know that you guys can make it work really, really well, even though you might, when you first see it, go, oh God, do I have to play so high? So if obviously with this ensemble, with the string quartet, it's not such a problem. Obviously I'm less comfortable with the cello, particularly because it's physically different, but I mean, in this particular instance, I think the part wasn't too hard at the clear, so I don't think I made any great risks, took any great risks there. But I think it's much more challenging when you're dealing with instruments that you don't know so intimately, or instrument families that you don't know so intimately. So, working with brass or woodwind, percussion, I often get that wrong. I find, and that's just kind of part of the learning process as a composer, and you're always learning, new things about what players can do. And also, the other big thing for me about this is also who are the players you're working with, because that is actually in some ways even more important than knowing the instruments, because there are some players that if you ask them to run around the room waving the instruments in the air and kind of oboe players kind of squeak their reed and whatever else it might be, or sort of break the instruments in two, some players are like, yeah, sure, great, I'm totally up for that, and other players will be, never, I'm not even going to think about that, just throw the piece in the bin and start again. So I think that really is the big thing for me, is sort of understanding to some degree the ensemble or the people you're working with, and saying, well, what these guys are looking for. And that's the other thing, is also in one context, one player might go, oh, you're totally up for that, and in another context they go, no, not going to do that. The difference between an orchestral context and a chamber context, and a chamber context and a solo context, and sort of understanding what players, even just things like rehearsal time, and knowing that a player will commit to a big violin concerto, they'll put big chunks of their life into that. They're not going to do that for an orchestral piece because they can't, and they probably will put maybe some sort of time into a chamber piece, but not really that kind of same sort of 3 months of my life practicing the same piece over and over again. So I guess all of those things are going through my mind while I'm composing and trying to be as sort of real world as possible without losing the idea, basically.
Actually, what I'd like to know what you've just been listening to the last few months, what you like, what you're into at the moment, sort of thing.
That's an incredibly hard question, Leo, to be really honest. I've always just loved listening to music, and I suppose the one thing I'll say actually is historically, I've got to know more music through live performance than through recordings and that sort of thing. And being stuck at home, although I did listen to a fair amount of music for various reasons, I actually listened to far less music than I would normally do. Weirdly, again, I was just stuck in front of my computer. Why didn't I have Spotify playing, 24/7? It's because I can't actually listen to music in the background. My choice is either the music's on and I'm listening to it, or I'm working. And I have occasionally sort of put music on whilst I'm working. I love listening to 8 Lines, for example, Steve Reich. If I'm working late at night, which does happen sometimes, and I just need to get through the night and kind of keep working, I'll put on 8 Lines and just kind of bop along to that because it's a fabulous piece. But I know that piece really intimately, and it's not the kind of piece where you have to listen in great detail to understand what the piece is doing. I've listened to it so many times. Things like John Cage's early music, I don't know if you know his string quartet in 4 parts. That's massively important to me. It's sort of fully notated score. All of those early pieces where he's using proportion and sound basically before he starts becoming experimental. Not that I don't like those pieces, but those early pieces are really important to me. Obviously, like I said, Reich particularly, Glass to some degree. Sort of some of the minimalists. Sciarrino is another composer. Actually, a lot of the sort of squeaky stuff that comes out in my music, the extended technique stuff, a lot of that, wouldn't say it's directly just Sciarrino, but hearing his solo violin, solo viola pieces was really important to me when that happened. There's also some traditional South African music that I have learned a lot from, and that kind of comes out in the music sometimes. Gosh, there's just, I just like lots of different types of music, really. I'm really interested in jazz. To a degree, I've learned a lot from jazz. Again, I don't sit and listen to it loads and loads, but electronica, Purcell, Mozart, one of my favorite composers. He always has been. Puccini, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Monteverdi, I just kind of like listening to music, really, to be honest.
And I've also that's exactly the sort of answer I was hoping for.
Yeah, recently I've been playing quite a bit of Bach to my sons. They've really got into Bach. The Wachet auf, for example, their name for it is quite interesting, but the Wachet auf, for reasons that I simply don't understand, I've ended up playing that for them quite a few times over the last few months while we're having breakfast, as you do. And this morning I played them the C Major Prelude just because they'd done their piano practice. We had a few minutes before we had to go to school, and off I went. Sorry, this is a very long rambly answer, but I don't quite know how else to do it.
No, that's brilliant. That's really interesting. Thank you. That's great.